Kia ora, I'm Davina Zimmer, and today on The Detail...
How would you feel if you found out you were part of a scientific experiment without your consent?
A university under fire for running a social experiment on how artificial intelligence can influence opinions and change people's views on issues. The Zurich research launched bot profiles of characters on Reddit, including a rape victim and a black man opposed to Black Lives Matter.
In this experiment, they created Reddit accounts and used them to post comments written by large language models.
A large language model, an LLM, is an AI system used to translate, answer questions, and generate text for chatbots. But how would you feel pouring your heart out to someone you felt a true connection with, only to find out that someone wasn't even a real person? Reddit users didn't know they were subjects of this study until after it had been completed, and they're not happy.
AI pretending to be human in online communities where people are trying to connect with other humans is inherently harmful.
This sort of thing happens every day, and people often don't realise it. So why was it not okay here?
My initial thoughts, I think, were quite similar to a lot of people on Reddit, which was, they've done what?
Well, what should they have done? Dr. Andrew Lenson is a senior lecturer in artificial intelligence at Victoria University.
It was quite shocking, I think, to me, because it's an example of where research has been done, I think, not in good faith.
Andrew ran the study by his colleagues on the Human Ethics Committee. They told him they'd never approve any research of this kind.
Because there is such a lack of consent in this process, right? So these researchers have gone and decided they're going to study this project on a Reddit subreddit, so on a community of people online. And there's been no way for the people in that community to say, yes, I will be part of this, or no, I don't want to be part of this. And that just sort of violates, ethical research 101, if you will.
So what is the 101? Andrew says there's no so-called ethics Bible, but there are a couple of fundamental principles that researchers across the board should follow.
Consent, primarily, is a big part of it. There are other aspects as well, of course. Even if you have consent, there are many things you can't do or things that you should be very careful with. But in my view, with a lot of AI research especially, it does come back to the idea of consent, which is that if you are going to run a study that involves human participants, then they need to opt in and they need to be consenting in an informed and free way. So we often talk about FPIC, which stands for free, prior and informed consent. And that is to say they don't have to take part, so that's the free bit. They consent before. You can't consent to something after you've already been studied, right? And then informed consent is you know enough about a study that you can make an informed decision. And so that, I guess, is one of the fundamental ways that we do research that I think has really not been followed here.
And has that way of research, has that always been the case of getting consent?
So we know that, quite a long time ago, or actually even more recently, in areas like psychology and healthcare, consent was never actually considered as strong as it is today. But certainly in the last, I would say, 30 or 40 years, there's been a lot more developments as far as what it means to do ethical research. But I think still in the AI field, this is quite a new problem for a lot of researchers, right? As AI researchers, we come from a background of working with computers and making algorithms. And so to now be in a situation where we're trying to better study the impacts of AI and things like chatbots on society and on the community, we almost need to do more upskilling in how we go about this and how we consider our research in a human light.
It's interesting how you mentioned how AI researchers are primarily involved with dealing with computers. So do you think that there's almost a lack of oversight when they have to deal with actual people?
I don't think there's a lack of oversight, because at least if I speak to New Zealand, we have very clear human ethics guidelines at our universities. As an AI researcher, I've gone through human ethics approval several times myself. So there's an awareness that it's something that has to be done, but perhaps we don't have the same research expertise in the field to guide people on how best to do that, how to go about the processes. And so maybe there's more of a chance for mistakes to happen. But I think even in this example, This is not an example of people who had the best intentions and then had an oopsie, if you will. This is an example where they're just not, I think, gone about it properly to start with. And so their research methods and the way they've approached this as a research topic has just been quite poorly thought out from the get-go. So I don't want to assume any ill intent on their part, because clearly from how they've spoken, they know their research is very important, and it is a really important topic. I want to say, this would never happen in New Zealand. Of course, I can't guarantee that, but the systems that we have in place, at least here at Victoria University of Wellington, will make it very hard to do this sort of research without it being flagged. And if you did, you'd be in a lot more trouble because you just completely avoided the whole ethical approval process. Whereas here, they got ethical approval, which, again, is slightly bewildering to me because there's so many, I guess, red flags.
So you said that we have systems in place here in New Zealand to avoid a situation like what's happened with the University of Zurich, and that you've been through the ethics approval process. Can you explain that? What does it look like?
Yeah, sure. So it's actually a reasonably intensive application process. So at Victoria University of Wellington, we have a human ethics committee, and they are basically the decision makers on whether or not research involving humans is allowable, balancing both the purpose of the research, the benefits to society, as well as any potential risks there may be. The way that actually works is that we have a series of guidelines that say, hey, here are some types of research involving humans that are so low risk, you don't need approval. And that might be things like if you have a conversation with an expert or something in a different field, and then obviously you don't need to get ethics approval, even though that may be informing your research. But anything that has any potential to be risky, and that can be really low level. It can be anything as simple as like an online survey. You have to put out a human ethics application, which is a reasonably big document, but I think is actually a really quite well-designed document because it forces you to think through what you're doing and why you're doing it and what the issues may be. And then that goes to the committee for consideration. And then based on that, you will inevitably get some feedback, some suggestions, and then usually you would make some changes and then it would get approved. In some cases, of course, with more risky research, ultimately it might not get approved, or the approval you get might be very different to your initial idea. But it is quite a rigorous process.
In a lengthy Reddit post admitting to their study, the researchers said, quote, to ethically test LLM's persuasive power in realistic scenarios, an unaware setting was necessary. And the University of Zurich's Ethics Committee did review the study, and it acknowledged getting prior consent was impractical. However, Andrew remains sceptical.
Prior consent is such a fundamental part of how we do good research that it's not an excuse to say, it's too hard to do it, or our experiment won't work. We would be, in that case, I think the Human Ethics Committee would be saying, well, how can you redesign your experiment so that you can get consent while still trying to meet the essence of what you're trying to study? So there was actually an example in that same thread where someone was talking about research done by OpenAI, which had a similar sort of research question, right? How do these chatbots affect online discussion, especially on controversial topics? And the way OpenAI did it was they didn't sort of inject their chatbot into the community. They took existing threads and then sort of asked the chatbot to respond, and then compared the chatbot responses to the human responses that were actually given in that thread. And then they had people essentially score them in a sort of blind way. So the person scoring them didn't know which was the chatbot and which was the human. And they could get to a lot of the same insights through that process. And sure, I understand there is, from the researchers in this topic's point of view, there is value in having a sort of a simpler approach where you put the chatbot in a sort of live environment. You can get much more direct insights, but there was always this balance in research involving humans, right, of consent and respect and ethics versus research effectiveness and efficiency. And at least in my mind, it's not a justification to say, we can't get the answers we want if we do things the right way. Like in clinical trials, right, we have a placebo group and we have a treatment group, right? So if you have a new drug being tested, people are giving consent and they know they may not get the new drug, they may get a placebo instead. And yet that's quite a high stakes scenario, and we still find a way to do consent. So when we have something that's really studying human AI interaction online, I mean, that's much lower stakes. So you should be able to find some sort of way to get consent while also furthering your research.
The Change My View moderators, which is the subreddit that was used to do this study on, referenced that OpenAI study and said that therefore the university's study on Reddit users was unnecessary because it had already been done by OpenAI.
I don't think that's entirely true, because I guess there's a few things there, right? One is OpenAI as a private company has obviously certain interests in this sort of research. So much like you wouldn't trust a pharmaceutical company who's funded drug research entirely, you may not trust OpenAI to fund AI research in an entirely transparent way. And so we always have those concerns when we see private companies doing research. And so there's always a need to have validation studies done. But I think also it's not that, you've done one study on this, you're done forever. Trends can change over time. You can have different versions of a study that are studying slightly different things or having slightly different questions. And so there still is a need for more and more research in this space for sure. But I think what the OpenAI study really shows us is that there's a right way and a wrong way to go about this.
In a sense, if you're told prior to this study, hey, we're going to do a study where we're going to release chatbots into the wild of Reddit to see whether they can persuade you and change your view on something, you would inherently be more cautious of it. So how do you kind of study the persuasive nature in a realistic scenario while not crossing the ethical line of consent?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I think it's quite a hard one to answer. I guess the slightly amusing tangent to that is that we know there's already probably chatbots on Reddit doing this exact thing, right? And so people being more conservative of how they interact with Reddit comments, for example, that's probably something we should already be doing as people on the internet. Anything that we read, especially comments on social media, may well be AI generated. And so we also need to start being more cautious there. But I guess speaking slightly more widely, how would you do this in a more ethical way? Again, this comes back to how you structure your research question and how you go about answering it. So if you, for example, got, 100 volunteers from the subreddit and says to them, okay, we're going to make this new separate subreddit just for this experiment. And on that, there will be a mixture of AI-generated responses and human-generated responses. We want you to go there, interact with it, and then we'll ask you some questions about your experiences. We might ask you to score some of the comments. You can do that sort of process, which is obviously more of a sandbox, but it's also more controlled. And so you do also then have more control over the study, which allows you to make perhaps stronger conclusions or to ask different questions and to test different hypotheses in a more controlled environment. And so I guess it's that kind of thinking, right? So you're going beyond sort of the simple approach of let's stick some AI in there, don't tell anyone, see how it goes, and then publish some things. So, okay, how do I design an experiment to answer a specific question where, yes, people know they're involved, but they don't necessarily know whether they're talking to an AI or talking to a human? Because I guess at the end of the day, that's what a lot of it is about, right? We want to know, are the AI responses more persuasive than human responses? And if they are, or even if they're not, how does it change the discourse in that discussion? Does it lead to more polarizing views or less polarizing views? It's all those sort of questions that are really interesting ones that I think these authors were sort of thinking about. And you can answer those without taking that sort of stick the AI in and see what happens approach.
Pew Research Center estimates that as much as 2/3 of tweeted links to popular websites are generated by bots.
So I wanted to talk about Meta populating things like Instagram and Facebook with AI users.
Bots have been invading comment sections across most social media platforms for a while now, and they can be tricky to detect. But there are a couple of telltale signs to look out for.
It does depend a little bit on the bot, and so it is hard to give general advice. But for ChatGPT, for example, I guess in some ways I kind of learned what its personality is, and I use that word personality very liberally. In that it gives quite, long-winded responses. It will always end its comment with sort of a wrap-up comment that feels slightly almost obtuse in some ways. It'll split things up into paragraphs quite nicely. It will have evidence and then discuss it. There won't be spelling mistakes. There won't be random extra full stops and spaces. It's all those sort of things. It's like the comment is almost too perfect or too academic almost to be organic. It's very hard to say, here are the rules, here are the signs, but through interacting with these things, you just get that sense.
And then I see, David pop in or Mike, and they're like, hi, you look like a nice person. Maybe we should be friends.
But the counter side to that is that is just one large language model by one company. For example, I haven't used things like Gemini or Claude, which are other large language models, as much as I have used ChatGPT. And so I probably wouldn't be as good at spotting those ones. And so I don't want to suggest that the way forward is we all get to know our ChatGPT and then we can sort of figure it out, because there's always going to be other models.
Are you saying that we as actual humans on social media just have to be a bit more cautious about the comments that we read and take into account that what we're reading might not actually have been written by an actual human?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we've long said, right, that you shouldn't trust anything you read online. And for a long time, that was from, I guess, a position that humans pretend to be experts online when they may not be. But now that same adage sort of holds true, in that when you read something online, it's very hard to be sure whether it was written by a human or by a bot. And it's not necessarily that the things posted by bots online are quote unquote bad, right? Like, we do things like talk to ChatGPT to get information and to talk about ideas and get counterpoints, and it's all very helpful. But as humans, we also want to know what is AI generated and what is human, because we value those things differently. When it's more emotional or more political, right, we tend to want human reactions and human responses. We don't want facts and sort of hot AI takes.
I mean, when we're talking about these emotional conversations, that just makes me think about the profiles that these researchers chose for these chatbots. I mean, there was a rape victim who'd been assaulted when they were 15 years old. There was a trauma counsellor and a black male opposing the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, these are pretty deep profiles to be using for this study. Did they have to go this extreme? I mean, could they not have just gone with something like, does pineapple go on pizza, and received similar results that they were after?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, pineapple definitely goes on pizza. I just want to make that clear. But no, I think you're entirely right. And again, I think that highlights why the study is so flawed, right? Because if participants knew in advance that they may be interacting with bots who were taking on personas, and that those personas would potentially be quite confronting, that is something that could be acceptable in research. That is informed consent. But the fact that there was no awareness, and now we have people who think they're connecting with someone, like the rape victim example is kind of terrifying, right? Because you may have someone on Reddit who has gone through a really traumatic experience, and they think, oh my God, I found someone to connect with, someone who has been through the same situation as me. Imagine they didn't find out, actually, no, it's an AI. It's such a violation of your trust. And that can be really harmful, because we know that especially sexual assault and things are so underreported, and there's so many issues with the number of victims we have of that, especially in New Zealand, and how challenging it is to process that and report it. And any sort of setback, like finding out that you weren't talking to a real person, can just ruin people's lives. And
even though this scenario could happen in real life outside of a research setting, you could have a chatbot that's posing as a sexual assault victim, and someone who's actually been assaulted does form a relationship with them and then later finds out that it's a bot. Even though that could happen outside of research, doesn't necessarily mean that you can go and research it. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Again, to take a slightly extreme example, right, where the researchers went and wrote hate speech online and saw how people reacted. There is a sort of an ethos, if you will, behind research, which is, it's not do no harm, but it's something pretty close to it, right? We are not in the business of trying to make people feel bad, right? Like, research as a topic or as something we do is all about trying to improve society. It's trying to
improve systems. It's trying to learn new things. It's trying to discover new things. It's often done from a place of curiosity, but that curiosity, I think, has always, or at least these days, is very much driven from a sense of purpose and from a sense of how can we improve things.
We can't ignore the benefits of these new AI technologies. For example, they've made it easier and quicker for businesses to manage customer inquiries. And on an individual level, they're a great tool for a quick summary of a topic. But there is concern that these bots could be used maliciously, so finding a way to manage and regulate the use of them is important. And to do that, we need research.
There is probably some need to run some controlled experiments of this kind to see how people interact with these bots and what the effect is. What is the scale of the problem? Is it going to polarize people, or is it going to bring people together? How do people feel, or how do they react when you tell them afterwards whether or not it was a bot or human? And why do they feel that way? What is that visceral reaction? And what does that then mean for how we want the internet or social media or even our society to operate with this influx of bots? And those are all, quite big questions, but to start answering those, for sure, we need more research.
So you're saying researching it is important, but not at the expense of compromising ethics.
Yeah, I think that's the main takeaway here, right?
And I guess in that sense, there are some things that we just can't control, and we have to learn to live with the fact that these chatbots are a part of reality, and sometimes we won't actually know the full effect of them in the real world until they're out in the real world and have perhaps caused harm.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's where we can also take a slightly defensive approach. And so that's why with my students, I'm focusing more and more on things like critical thinking skills, even just encouraging skepticism, right? So when you read something online, especially in a slightly more high stakes environment or a more emotional topic, how are you validating that what is true or is genuine? Are you going back and looking at the facts of the story? Are you looking at who wrote it? Are you looking at their reputation and their history? Are there ways there that you can try and get a better sense of, first of all, what you're reading is true, and second of all, is it likely to be written by a human? And also, does it matter if it was written by a human, right? If I'm trying to find out how big Angola is or something, does it really matter if a human has written that blog post or an AI has written it? I mean, yes, there's a whole question there about AI replacing humans in jobs and things, but thinking purely in terms of information and whether or not we can trust it, right? There are things where it's not a big problem. The way that we interact with the internet and social media has basically been founded on, this is a really cool way to talk to other humans and interact with other humans. And that sort of fundamental assumption has been broken. And so we now need to be almost retraining ourselves and retraining, I think, especially both the younger and sort of older generations who are more vulnerable in some ways, to be thinking about this critically and be trying to learn some of those skills to perhaps second guess what they're reading.
That's all for today. The Detail is a Newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Andrew Lenson. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Alexia Russell. I'm Davina Zimmer. Ka kite anō.